The wind carried the scent of hay and dust across the wide fields, and the ranch sat quietly under the late afternoon sun. Jake had grown used to silence, though it was never truly empty. The absence of his wife lingered in every corner of the house, every creak of the wooden floor, every folded blanket she had once tucked around their little girl. His daughter, Emily, was only 4, with wide brown eyes that had already seen more loss than any child should have. Jake tried to fill the emptiness with work, mending fences, herding cattle, keeping the place alive the way his father had taught him, but grief had a way of slipping past sweat and grit. And Emily, though bright and curious, often looked at him with questions he couldn't answer. On one of those weary afternoons, when the sun sagged low and the chores seemed endless, a stranger rode up. She was a young woman, her clothes plain but neat, her eyes cautious yet steady. Her name was Clara. She had come looking for work, explaining she could cook, clean, help with the animals, whatever was needed. Jake wasn't eager to open his world to someone new. Folks in town had offered help before, but pity had a sharp edge, and he was tired of being a story whispered about in the mercantile. Still, the ranch was too big for him alone, and Emily needed more than he could give while drowning in work. Emily stood in the doorway, clutching a ragged doll to her chest as Clara introduced herself. For a moment, Clara knelt to Emily's level, her smile soft, her voice gentle. Emily sniffed the air, the way children sometimes do, and whispered, almost in awe, "She smells like Mama." The words struck Jake harder than any blow. He froze, his throat tightening, as Clara's expression faltered. She hadn't expected such a greeting, and Jake could see the conflict in her eyes. From that moment, something shifted. Clara wasn't just another hand on the ranch. Emily began following her around, holding her hand, sitting close whenever she read aloud. Clara hummed old songs while cooking, songs Jake realized he hadn't heard since his wife passed. He found himself lingering in the doorway, listening to Emily's laughter as Clara braided her hair or tucked her in. And though Jake fought it, though he told himself he needed no one, there was a quietness that Clara carried with her, a steadiness that softened the rough edges of his days. Jake resisted at first. He told himself it wasn't right to let someone step into a place that had belonged to his wife. He buried himself in work, keeping his distance, but every night Emily would ask, "Will she stay?" And Jake didn't have the heart to answer. Clara never pushed, never tried to replace what was lost. She simply cared, in ways both small and profound, fixing Emily's torn clothes, leaving warm meals ready when Jake came in late, offering silence when the weight of memory pressed too heavy. One evening, a storm rolled in fast from the horizon, thunder cracking across the fields. Emily was frightened, crying out as the wind rattled the windows. Jake went to comfort her, but Clara was already there, holding the little girl close, rocking her gently. Emily's sobs quieted, her small hand curled around Clara's finger, and her breathing steadied against her shoulder. Jake stood in the doorway, watching them, something unspoken tightening in his chest. Later that night, when the storm had passed and the house was still again, Jake sat alone at the kitchen table. Clara entered softly, her hair damp from the rain where she had helped him secure the barn. She moved to pour him coffee, her presence both ordinary and extraordinary. He caught her hand before she could pull away, and for the first time, he let himself meet her eyes fully. There was no pity there, only understanding. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. Clara became a part of their world without forcing her way into it. Emily no longer cried at night as often, her laughter more frequent, her steps lighter. Jake began to realize that the smell Emily had spoken of wasn't about perfume or soap. It was about safety, warmth, the kind of comfort that only love could bring. And slowly, despite every wall he had built, Jake found he couldn't imagine the ranch, the house, or his daughter's future without Clara in it. Something in her belonged there, as naturally as the wind in the grass or the sunrise over the fields. She wasn't replacing what had been lost, nothing could, but she was stitching new life into the pieces that remained. The days on the ranch began early and ended late, but with Clara around, there was a different rhythm to them, a quiet harmony that had been missing since the house fell silent after Jake's wife passed. The mornings had once been hollow, filled only with the scraping of his boots and the sound of the kettle whistling on the stove. Emily would sit quietly at the table, her doll propped up beside her, waiting for him to say something, anything, to fill the silence. But he rarely had the words. Now, When the sun crept up over the horizon, Clara was already awake, moving through the kitchen with a steadiness that wrapped the air in warmth. She hummed under her breath while she stirred the oats. Emily's giggle carried from where she sat on the counter watching. Jake would walk in, his hat still damp from dew, and pause just inside the door. He didn't mean to linger, but something about the sight stopped him. The way Clara's hair caught the light as she leaned toward Emily, the way Emily reached for her with the ease of trust, the sound of their laughter blending together. He always told himself to just keep moving, to grab his coffee and head out to the fields, but more and more, he found himself hesitating, listening, as though those moments stitched something back together in him he hadn't realized was torn. Clara was careful. She never stepped too far, never presumed her place. She made sure Jake saw her as nothing more than someone helping out, though Jake could sense there was more to her story than she let on. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her gaze drifted across the fields with a kind of wistfulness, as if she, too, carried ghosts. He never asked. They were both people marked by loss in different ways, and neither of them pressed where scars might run too deep. Emily adored her, though. It was in the way she reached for Clara's hand without thinking, in the way she tugged her along to show her the baby calves or the wildflowers growing by the fence line. One evening, Emily had taken one of her crayons and drawn a picture on a scrap of paper, a stick figure family, with Jake on one side, Emily in the middle, and Clara on the other. Emily had colored a big yellow sun above them, and when Jake found it on the kitchen table, his throat had gone tight. He folded the paper gently and tucked it into the top drawer of his desk, where it remained. Life on a ranch was never easy, but Clara's presence softened the edges of the hardest days. When a cow fell ill, she was there holding the lantern steady in the dark. When the fence broke in the middle of a storm, she pulled her shawl tighter and came out to hold tools, her hair plastered to her cheeks from the rain. And when Jake came in bone-tired, his hands blistered and back aching, the smell of warm stew would meet him at the door, and her voice, calm and low, would remind him to sit, to eat, to breathe. But it wasn't just the help that unsettled him, it was the way she cared for Emily. One afternoon, he found them sitting beneath the big oak tree near the barn. Clara's fingers were gently weaving ribbons into Emily's hair, and Emily was babbling about the stars she wanted to see that night. Clara listened with the kind of focus Jake rarely managed, as though every word mattered. Emily tilted her head, eyes wide with wonder, and asked if the stars could hear wishes. Clara smiled and told her yes, but whispered that sometimes wishes came true not because of the stars, but because people found the courage to make them happen. Jake hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but hearing it had left him shaken in a way he couldn't name. The town noticed. Folks began to whisper when Jake came into the mercantile with Clara and Emily by his side. They didn't say much outright, just curious glances, a tilt of a hat, a murmur under breath, but Jake felt the weight of it. He wasn't sure if it was judgment or speculation, but it pressed on him nonetheless. He told himself Clara didn't belong tied to a man who was already broken, tied to a ranch that demanded more than it gave. And yet, each time he thought about letting her go, about telling her she didn't need to stay, his chest constricted in a way that made the thought unbearable. Clara, for her part, never seemed to mind the whispers. If she heard them, she gave no sign. She moved with quiet dignity, her focus always on Emily or the work that needed doing. One night, though, when Jake caught her staring out at the horizon long after the lamps had been turned down, he stepped onto the porch beside her. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the low rumble of cattle in the distance. Finally, he asked, "You ever think about leaving?" Her eyes flicked toward him, surprised by the question, then drifted back to the horizon. "I've thought about a lot of things," she said softly. "But Emily, she makes it hard to imagine walking away." Jake didn't know how to answer, so he said nothing. But the truth buried itself deep in him. It wasn't just Emily who made it hard. As the seasons shifted, so did the bond between them. In the spring, Clara helped plant the vegetable garden, kneeling in the dirt beside Emily, teaching her how to press seeds gently into the soil. In the summer, they gathered wildflowers to place in vases around the house, bringing life back to rooms that had long felt empty. In the fall, she stood beside Jake as they harvested, her hands blistered, her laughter carrying over the fields. And in winter, when the snow fell heavy and the nights stretched long, she read stories by the fire while Emily curled against her, and Jake found himself watching the glow of the flames reflected in her eyes. One bitterly cold night, Emily woke with a fever. Panic clawed at Jake's chest as he held her little body hot against his arm. He fumbled to mix medicine, his hands shaking, but Clara took over with a calmness that steadied him. She bathed Emily's forehead with a cool cloth, whispered soothing words, and stayed awake the entire night by her side. Jake sat across the room, watching, powerless, until Emily's breathing finally eased. When dawn broke and Emily slept peacefully, Jake's eyes met Clara's across the room. No words were spoken, but something passed between them, an unspoken vow, a recognition that she wasn't just passing through their lives. She was part of them now. Still, Jake fought it. He told himself it wasn't fair to her, that he had nothing left to give but a ranch that demanded everything and a heart still scarred. But then there were moments, small, undeniable moments, that chipped away at his resistance. Emily running across the yard shouting, "Clara, look at me." With the kind of joy only a child can carry. Clara leaning over the stove, her hair loose, humming the same lullaby his wife once sang. The way she glanced at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze tender and unguarded. And then, one evening, after a long day of work, Jake walked into the kitchen to find Clara and Emily baking together. Flour dusted Clara's cheeks, Emily's hands sticky with dough. They both looked up at him, laughing, and in that instant, something broke open in him. The grief was still there, the memory of his wife still carved deep, but alongside it, something new had taken root. Something he hadn't thought possible again. He knew then, as surely as he knew the land beneath his boots, that he couldn't let her go. The frost still clung to the edges of the window when Jake woke before dawn, the same way he had for years. The ranch never cared about grief or joy, cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, work always demanded its due. But the house had changed. Where once there was only silence, now there were small sounds, Emily's soft breathing down the hall, the faint clatter of Clara moving in the kitchen before the sun rose. Jake pulled on his boots and hat and made his way out into the cold, the crunch of snow beneath his feet reminding him of winters past, when his wife had still been alive. He swallowed hard against the ache that came with the memory, the ache that had lived in him so long he wasn't sure it would ever fade. By the time he returned from the barn, Clara was setting breakfast on the table. Emily sat there already, swinging her legs beneath her chair, her hair tied up neatly in braids Clara must have done. She grinned when she saw him. "Papa, Clara says the calves will be born soon. Can I help?" Jake hung his hat on the peg by the door and glanced at Clara. She gave a small shrug, the faintest smile on her lips. "She's been asking all morning," Clara said. "I told her it depends on you." Jake sat heavily in his chair, pouring himself coffee. He looked at Emily's eager face, her eyes so much like her mother's, and for a moment he almost said no. He wanted to keep her safe from everything, even the rough edges of ranch life. But Clara caught his eye, and in her steady gaze he saw something unspoken, something urging him not to hold the girl too tightly, not to smother her with fear. He cleared his throat. "All right. But you listen close, and you do exactly as I say." Emily squealed, clapping her hands. Clara's laugh followed, a sound so warm it made Jake's chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. He ate quietly while they talked, watching the way Clara cut Emily's food for her, the way she leaned in to listen as though every word mattered. It reminded him of the life he'd lost, but it also filled him with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. That evening, when the first calf came, Emily was there beside him, Clara holding her close against the cold. Emily's eyes went wide as the tiny creature stumbled into the world, slick and trembling. Jake knelt beside it, wiping it down with old burlap. He glanced up to see Clara's face, soft with wonder, her arms tight around Emily as though she were protecting her from everything that could harm her. And for the first time, Jake didn't feel alone in that barn. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch rolled on as it always did. But life within the house changed in ways Jake could never have predicted. Clara brought color back into the rooms. Not in big ways, just little touches. A vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. Fresh curtains she sewed herself. The smell of pies cooling on the counter. The old piano in the parlor, untouched since his wife's passing, rang out again under Clara's hands, though she always played softly, as though afraid to intrude on the silence of memory. Emily flourished under her care. The little girl who had once been quiet and withdrawn now laughed freely, her voice filling the rooms. She ran across the yard, hair flying, shouting for Clara to come chase her. She sang along with Clara's songs, her small voice tumbling through words she barely understood. At night, when Jake paused outside her bedroom, he often found Clara sitting on the edge of Emily's bed, stroking her hair while she drifted to sleep. More than once, Jake caught Emily whispering, "You smell like Mama," her voice slurred with drowsiness. Clara never corrected her, never pulled away. She simply bent down and kissed the top of Emily's head, as though the comparison was a gift she cherished quietly. Jake wrestled with it all. He wanted to be grateful, wanted to simply accept what Clara was bringing into their lives. But guilt gnawed at him. He loved his wife still, would always love her. Letting Clara in felt, in some corner of his mind, like betrayal. He told himself Clara was only here to help, that she deserved more than to be bound to a man who was half broken, a man whose best parts had been buried with the woman he'd lost. But then there were moments he couldn't ignore. The night Emily fell while running and scraped her knee, Clara scooped her up before Jake even moved, murmuring comfort as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. Jake stood useless beside them, realizing Clara had stepped seamlessly into a role he couldn't fill alone. Or the evening when he came in from a long day, his shoulders aching, and Clara placed a hand on his arm, just for a second, steady and reassuring. That touch lingered long after she pulled away, setting fire to something in him he thought had died. Winter thawed into spring, and with it came change. One Sunday, Jake reluctantly agreed to take Clara and Emily into town for church. He hadn't been in months, unwilling to face the curious stares, the whispers. But Clara insisted it would be good for Emily. So they went. Emily clung to Clara's hand as they walked up the church steps, her little dress swaying. Inside, people turned to look, their eyes sharp with interest. Jake felt heat rise in his neck, prepared for the pity, the judgment. But Clara held her head high, her grip on Emily firm, her presence quiet yet unyielding. After the service, an older woman approached, her eyes kind but probing. "Is this your new wife?" she asked Jake, her tone gentle. He froze, words lodged in his throat. Clara's eyes flicked to him, then down to Emily. For a heartbeat, the silence felt endless. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. She's helping out at the ranch." The woman smiled faintly, though Jake could see the curiosity lingering. Clara gave nothing away, only bent to adjust Emily's bonnet, her face unreadable. But when they returned to the wagon, the air between Jake and Clara felt charged, heavy with words unsaid. That night, after Emily was asleep, Clara stepped out onto the porch. Jake followed after a long moment, standing beside her in the cool night air. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the stars. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she murmured. But he could hear the faint tremor in her voice, the way it wasn't quite steady. He wanted to tell her she meant more than just someone helping out, that he couldn't imagine the ranch without her, that Emily wasn't the only one who leaned on her now. But the words stuck. All he managed was, "Emily, she needs you." Clara's lips curved faintly, but her eyes glistened in the starlight. "And what about you, Jake?" she asked softly. His breath caught, but before he could answer, she turned and slipped inside. The question haunted him for days. What about him? He had convinced himself that all he needed was to survive, to raise Emily as best he could, to keep the ranch going. But Clara's presence had shown him something else, that life could be more than just enduring. That there could still be laughter, warmth, even love. But admitting it felt dangerous, as though saying it aloud might shatter everything. The breaking point came one summer evening. The day had been long, the cattle restless in the heat. Jake came in exhausted, his shirt clinging to his back. In the kitchen, he found Clara and Emily making lemonade, the air filled with their laughter. Emily spotted him and cried out, "Papa, Clara says I should sing at the fair. She says I'm good enough." Jake looked at Clara, who blushed faintly but nodded. "She has a beautiful voice," Clara said. "She should share it." Jake's heart clenched at the pride in Clara's eyes, pride for a child that wasn't hers, but whom she loved as if she were. He realized then that Clara wasn't just filling a role. She wasn't just helping. She had woven herself into their lives in a way that was permanent, in a way that couldn't be undone. And he, despite his fear, his guilt, didn't want it undone. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jake finally spoke. He lives in a way that was permanent, in a way that couldn't be undone. And he, despite his fear, his guilt, didn't want it undone. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jake finally spoke. He found Clara in the parlor, her fingers tracing the keys of the old piano without playing. He stood in the doorway, his hands rough and clumsy, his heart pounding. "Clara," he said quietly. She looked up, her eyes searching his. He crossed the room slowly, as though every step mattered. "You've given Emily something I thought she'd lost forever. You've given me something I didn't think I could have again." His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "I don't want you to go. Not now, not ever." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Her hands trembled in her lap. Then, slowly, she rose, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name. She stepped close, so close he could feel her warmth, her breath. "I was afraid you'd never say it," she whispered. Jake's hand lifted, hesitant, brushing against hers. It wasn't a grand moment, not a sweeping declaration. But it was real, raw, and for the first time in years, Jake felt alive. Emily's voice called faintly from down the hall, and Clara smiled, stepping back. Jake watched her go to comfort the child, his heart heavy but full. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would always be whispers, always shadows of the past. But there was also light now, fragile and growing. And for the first time, Jake wasn't afraid to reach for it. The days began to lengthen, the sun stretching higher over the horizon, and with it came a rhythm that felt almost natural, as if Clara had been part of their lives far longer than the few months since she first rode onto the ranch. Jake rose before dawn, but now he wasn't greeted by silence when he returned from the barn. Clara would already be in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, a soft hum slipping from her lips while she worked. Emily would be perched on a stool, helping stir batter or setting forks at the table, her braids lopsided from Clara's hands fumbling with the ribbons in the half-dark. Jake would watch them for a moment before entering, caught by the strange piece of it all, a piece he had thought he'd lost forever. Emily clung to Clara as though she'd been waiting for her all her little life. When she scraped her knee or woke from a nightmare, she didn't always run straight to her father anymore. Sometimes she called for Clara. Jake told himself it didn't bother him, that he was grateful his daughter had someone to soothe her when his own words felt clumsy, but deep down, he knew it stirred something else, something that left his chest tight. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe guilt, or maybe it was the ache of knowing that his little girl was beginning to heal in ways he couldn't manage alone. It was the spring fair in town that tested them most. Emily begged to go for weeks, her eyes wide with excitement, chattering about the horses, the games, the music. Jake wasn't fond of the idea. Crowds made him uneasy, especially since people never quite stopped whispering about the widowed rancher and the woman who'd stepped into his life so quietly. But Clara insisted. "She deserves joy," Clara said softly as she sewed a new dress for Emily, her fingers deft over the fabric. "She deserves to feel like every other little girl." So they went. Emily ran ahead, her laughter bubbling through the air as she darted from booth to booth, Clara's skirts brushing just behind her to keep her close. Jake followed with his usual guarded watchfulness, tipping his hat to the familiar faces of neighbors, ignoring the speculative glances. People stared openly now, some smiling in what looked like approval, others with pursed lips and quiet judgment. Clara never flinched. She held Emily's hand with quiet assurance, her smile easy, her posture calm. When Emily climbed onto the small stage to sing in the children's showcase, Jake's stomach knotted. But Clara crouched beside her, whispering encouragement before stepping back. The music began, and Emily's small voice carried over the crowd. It wasn't perfect, but it was pure, and Jake's heart nearly burst with pride. He saw Clara standing nearby, her eyes glistening, her lips curved in a smile that spoke of more than admiration. She looked at Emily as though she were her own. Afterward, when people clapped and cheered, Emily ran first to Clara, leaping into her arms. Clara hugged her tight, laughing as Emily declared, "I did it, just like you said." Jake walked over slowly, something raw and unsteady building inside him. He reached out and smoothed his daughter's hair, his hand brushing against Clara's in the process. She looked up at him, and in that brief moment, with the fair's noise spinning around them, Jake saw a future he hadn't dared imagine. That night, when the ranch was quiet again, Jake found himself unable to sleep. He walked to the porch, staring out over the field silvered by moonlight. He heard the door open softly behind him and knew it was Clara. She stepped beside him, her shawl wrapped tight, her hair catching the faint glow. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Jake said, "She's happier than I've seen her in years." Clara nodded. Children know when they're safe. When they're loved. Jake turned his head, studying her in the dim light. "You've given her that. You've given me that." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the same fear he carried in his own chest, that to name what they felt might break it, might dishonor the love they had lost before. He wanted to tell her then, wanted to take her hand and say she wasn't just helping, she was home. But Emily's soft call from her room interrupted, and Clara slipped inside with a faint smile, leaving Jake alone with the words still burning on his tongue. The summer came harsh and dry. The rains were late, the grass brittle beneath their boots, the cattle restless from the heat. Jake worked himself to exhaustion, his body aching from long days under the sun. Clara worked just as hard, her skin bronzed from the fields, her hands calloused. Yet even in the grueling heat, she found ways to make life lighter. She brought watermelons from town, slicing them open on the porch so juice dripped down Emily's chin while she giggled. She stitched lighter clothes for Emily to wear, taught her to make lemonade, and found shade under the oak tree where they'd sit together, reading aloud while cicadas sang. One day, after a long stretch without rain, Jake collapsed onto the porch. Steps at dusk, sweat dripping down his temples. He felt Clara's shadow before he saw her. She set a glass of cool water in his hand, her gaze steady. "You can't carry it all alone," she said quietly. He gave a short laugh, bitter and tired. "Been carrying it alone for a long time." She knelt beside him then, her hand brushing his arm. "Not anymore." The touch was small, fleeting, but it pierced him deeper than anything else. For the rest of the night, he lay awake, her words echoing in his mind. Not anymore. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to let himself believe that the burden didn't have to be his alone, that the ranch, the grief, the raising of Emily could be something shared. But fear lingered. What if Clara left? What if she found the life she truly deserved, away from the ranch and its endless demands, away from a man too scarred to give her the love she deserved? The thought gnawed at him until one day he found her saddling her horse near the barn. His chest clenched, panic clawing at him. "You leaving?" he asked, harsher than he meant. Clara looked up, startled. "No," she said softly, patting the mare's neck. "Just riding out to the ridge. Emily wanted to see the wildflowers." Relief flooded him, almost dizzying. He turned away before she could see how much the question had cost him. The drought finally broke in late summer, rain sweeping across the land in fierce torrents. The earth drank deeply, the cattle calmed, and life on the ranch steadied again. But with the storm came another kind of reckoning. One night, lightning struck near the northern pasture, setting a patch of grass aflame. Jake rode out at once, Clara insisting on coming too. The fire was small but fierce, and they worked together in the pounding rain, stamping out flames, guiding the cattle away. At one point, Clara slipped, mud streaking her dress. Jake caught her arm, holding her tight. In the wild rush of firelight and rain, their eyes locked, and for an instant, the world narrowed to just the two of them. His grip lingered long after the danger passed. Later, back at the house, soaked and weary, Jake found Clara at the kitchen table, her hair damp, her hands trembling faintly. He poured her tea, setting it before her. She looked up, and something in her eyes broke through his last defense. He sat across from her, the silence thick between them. Finally, he said, "Clara, I don't know how to say this right. I don't even know if I should. But I can't keep pretending you're just here to help. You're more. You've become more." Her breath caught. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I've felt it too," she whispered. "But I was afraid you weren't ready. Afraid of being a shadow in someone else's home." Jake closed his rough hand around hers. "You're not a shadow. You're the light we've been missing." Her tears fell then, silent but sure, and when he rose to pull her into his arms, she didn't resist. For the first time in years, Jake let himself hold someone close, let himself believe that maybe love wasn't finished with him after all. Emily stirred in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, her small voice calling, "Papa." "Clara." They pulled apart quickly, but Jake knelt and scooped Emily up, holding her tight. Clara stood beside them, smoothing Emily's hair with gentle fingers. And in that moment, with his daughter safe in his arms and Clara's hand steady on both of them, Jake knew there was no turning back. Life moved forward. The whispers in town never fully stopped, but Jake no longer cared. Clara stayed, and her presence only deepened. Emily blossomed into a child full of laughter, her world whole again in ways Jake hadn't thought possible. The ranch thrived with Clara's touch woven into every corner, her quiet strength steady beside his own. There were still hard days, storms, sickness, long nights of worry. But there were also mornings filled with the smell of fresh bread, evenings of music at the old piano, laughter drifting through the house. Jake carried his memories of his wife with tenderness, but he no longer carried them alone. Clara never asked him to forget. She simply helped him remember while still moving forward. And slowly, Jake realized that the girl who had once been a stranger at his door had become the heart of his home. The seasons turned again, as they always did, one folding into the other. The years carried on the same wind that rustled through the grasslands and swept over the ridges. What had once felt fragile, as though it might be broken by a whisper or a passing glance, grew into something steady, unshakable. Jake no longer woke to silence, no longer carried the weight of an empty house on his shoulders alone. Clara's presence was no longer something he second-guessed or explained away. She was not a visitor, not someone passing through. She was part of them, as sure and permanent as the land beneath their boots. Emily grew, her laughter louder, her questions endless. She followed Jake into the barn, demanding to learn how to rope and ride, her determination fierce. She followed Clara into the kitchen and garden, learning to knead dough, to press seeds into soil, to stitch torn fabric with patience. But more than skills, Emily grew with a confidence and joy that had once seemed lost to her. The shadows that had lingered after her mother's death faded slowly under the steady light of Clara's care. The child who had once clung to her doll in silence now filled the house with song, with chatter, with dreams about the future. Jake watched it all with a heart that ached and swelled at the same time. He saw the way Emily leaned against Clara as though she had always belonged there. He saw the way Clara's eyes softened when Emily called out, "Mama," by mistake and then froze, uncertain. Clara never corrected her, never pulled away. She simply folded Emily close, her lips pressing to the top of her head as if sealing the moment with love. And Jake knew then that whatever guilt he had clung to about replacing what was lost was misplaced. Clara wasn't replacing anyone. She was building something new, something just as real and just as needed. The town eventually stopped whispering. People still looked, still wondered, but as months turned into years, it became clear that Clara wasn't leaving. She was at Jake's side at every gathering, her quiet grace smoothing edges he never even noticed in himself. When Emily performed in school recitals or helped at church events, Clara was there, her pride unmistakable. Jake began to notice how people's eyes softened when they looked at them, as though the story of the widowed rancher and the stranger had turned into something else, something people rooted for, rather than questioned. Yet, there were trials, as there always are. One winter brought sickness to the cattle, a fever that swept through the herd. Jake worked night and day, barely sleeping, his body near breaking. Clara was there in the freezing barns with him, lantern light casting shadows across her determined face. She held ropes, mixed medicine, comforted calves as they shivered. When Jake finally collapsed into a chair, Clara's hand brushed his brow, her voice low but firm, telling him he could not carry it all alone. He wanted to argue, to insist that he was the one responsible, but when he looked at her, weary but steadfast, he saw the truth. They were carrying it together now. Emily grew tall, her legs longer, her questions harder. She began to resemble her mother in ways that tugged at Jake's heart, but she also carried Clara in her, in the way she held herself, in the kindness she gave so freely. Clara never demanded the title of mother, but Emily gave it to her anyway, sometimes shyly, sometimes boldly. And when she did, Clara would simply smile and hold her tighter, her eyes glistening with a joy that words couldn't contain. As years passed, Jake and Clara's bond deepened into something unspoken but unbreakable. They never had a grand moment, no single declaration that changed everything. Instead, it was built in 1,000 small ways. The way Clara's hand lingered on his arm when he came in weary from the fields, the way Jake's eyes softened when he watched her brush Emily's hair, the way their steps fell in rhythm when they walked the land together. Love came not as a storm but as a steady rain, seeping into the cracks, nourishing what had once been barren. Still, Jake carried his ghosts. There were nights he sat alone on the porch, staring at the stars, his heart heavy with memories of his wife. Clara never intruded, never demanded he leave those memories behind. Instead, she would quietly bring him a cup of coffee or sit beside him without a word, her presence a reminder that the past could be honored without chaining the future. One night, he finally spoke of it, the fear that loving again meant forgetting. Clara listened, her hand folded into his, and when he finished, she whispered, "Love doesn't replace. It grows. There's room for her and for me, because both made you who you are. Both make Emily who she is." Her words loosened something in him, something he hadn't even known he was still holding. Emily grew into a young woman before they knew it, her childhood slipping away as swiftly as the changing seasons. She learned to ride as well as Jake, to cook as well as Clara, her spirit fierce and gentle all at once. She talked of dreams beyond the ranch, school, adventures, maybe even the city one day. Jake's chest tightened at the thought of letting her go, but Clara's steady hand reminded him that love meant giving wings, not chains. When Emily left for school, the house felt emptier again, though not hollow as it once had. Clara and Jake stood together on the porch, watching their daughter ride away toward her future. Clara slipped her hand into his, and Jake realized with quiet clarity that he wasn't facing the emptiness alone this time. They had built something strong enough to endure distance, strong enough to carry them through the shifting seasons of life. In the years that followed, the ranch remained their constant companion. Work never ended, struggles came and went, but so did joy. There were nights of music and laughter, mornings of simple peace. There were moments when Jake caught Clara's eyes across the room and felt the same pull he'd felt the first time he saw her cradling Emily, a pull that whispered, "You belong to each other." And though he had once thought himself too broken, too burdened by grief, he realized now that it was precisely because of that grief that he could understand the depth of what they had. Clara never stopped humming in the kitchen, never stopped bringing life to quiet corners. Jake never stopped rising before dawn, never stopped tending the land with his hands. But together, they had made the ranch more than just survival. They had made it a home, filled with love that was steady, quiet, enduring. And when Emily returned years later, grown and strong, bringing with her stories of the wider world, she still paused at the threshold of the old house and said, "It smells like home." Jake glanced at Clara then, and Clara smiled, the same soft, steady smile that had changed everything. Jake reached for her hand, his rough fingers closing over hers. He had lost much in his life, carried grief so deep. It nearly consumed him, but he had also found something he never thought possible again. And as the wind swept over the fields, carrying with it the scent of earth and hay, Jake knew he had been given more than a second chance. He had been given a life remade, not by forgetting the past, but by opening his heart to the love that had walked quietly into his world and never let go.